From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
And so how wonderful this afternoon that we have someone in our midst who will talk to us, someone who made constitutional law. And I'm going to take a leap of faith here and say, made American history, or made history in America. And this is Jim Obergefell, who was the plaintiff in Obergefell versus Hodges, a decision that was issued just a year ago by the United States Supreme Court. We're honored. He's here with a co-author of a book, Debbie Cenziper, who's also in her own right Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and our colleague at the Library of Congress, Travis Painter, who's also a member of the Globe Steering Committee, will really take charge of the remainder of the program.
Hello. Thank you so much to our Law Librarian of Congress, Rhoda Schaefer, for not only being a part of this, but for the Law Library of Congress that supported this event. Which is at the back. We just wanted to give a little context, his story, just so you kind of understand what the process went through and what the book really is about, which obviously goes into much more detail. Jim and his partner, John Author, together for 20 years, loving and committed relationship. And during that time, they were not able to marry. In 2013, with the repeal of DOMA, Offensive Marriage Act, they then had the option, and some in the United States had, but it was not for the entire nation at that time. Most of us were celebrating the Windsor decision. The United States were celebrating. And John Author had been diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, about that time. They lived in Ohio, a state that did not recognize same-sex marriage. So they decided to solidify their relationship and fly to Maryland, a state that did recognize, outsource, raise money, to be able to pay a medical charter jet to fly to Maryland and land on the tarmac where John Author's aunt officiated the wedding, and they exchanged their vows on the tarmac. All of that to return back to Cincinnati, Ohio, where they were presented with an impending death certificate that would be handed to them that was pointed out under marriage status. It would say single, and the spouse's name would be left blank. They wanted the final document of John's life to represent the accuracy of the relationship and the bond that they had made, and from that decided to pursue lawsuit, pursue the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. From that, progressed onward. Sadly, during the court battle, John did pass away, but Jim decided to keep fighting, which led to the Supreme Court case of Obergefell v. Hodges. Just this past Sunday, June 26th, as a nation, we celebrated the one-year anniversary of Obergefell v. Hodges. And Justice Kennedy, he read the Supreme Court decision. And I know I will not even be able to come close to how powerful and amazing it was when he read this. But I wanted to just put into context, as a nation, how the feeling was when the decision was rendered. And then we will invite them into stage. Since the dawn of history, marriage has transformed strangers into relatives, binding families and societies together, and it must be acknowledged that the opposite-sex character of marriage, one man, one woman, has long been viewed as essential to its very nature and purpose. As the court's analysis and the opinion today brings with these millennia of human experience, but it does not end there. For the history of marriage is one of both continuity and change. Until recent decades, few persons had even thought about or considered the concept of same-sex marriage. In part, that is because homosexuality was condemned and criminalized by many states through the mid-20th century. It was deemed an illness by most experts. Although the limitation of marriage to opposite-sex couples may long have seemed natural and just, Its inconsistency with the right to marry is now manifest. The court now holds that same-sex
I was. Bridget Kuntz, that was the very first hearing on our case. You know, we got married on a Thursday, and by virtue of friends connecting us with a friend of theirs who's a civil rights attorney, we met that attorney on Tuesday. We filed suit on Friday, so we filed suit 8 days after we got married, and on Monday, 11 days after we got married, I was in federal district court, and that was when Bridget Kuntz was defending the state against our lawsuit. And I remember in that courtroom thinking, her heart doesn't quite seem in it. And I honestly thought, so I wonder, was she the last person in the office this morning? And the decision was, last in the office has to go to court. So it was, for me, it was really fun to learn that I picked up on something that she felt. She was conflicted. She was doing her job, and I respect her for that. And she did her best. She did her job to fight for the state of Ohio. But it was really kind of nice to learn that she was personally conflicted and was on our side. And I have to say, the other great thing that happened in that very first hearing, when we filed suit, we've filed suit against the state of Ohio and the city of Cincinnati. And in that very first hearing, the city solicitor for the city of Cincinnati stood up in court and said, and I'm paraphrasing this, Your Honor, the city of Cincinnati agrees with John and Jim. Their marriage deserves to be recognized. And for me, that was one of the most powerful experiences I'd had, because, you know, for years, Cincinnati was considered the most gay, unfriendly city in the country. And to have the city stand up in court and say, we're on your side, that was an amazing thing. So I was in court for that. When Al started a second lawsuit about birth certificates, I was in their hearing. I was in every single court hearing that I could attend.
Did you feel that support and that conviction? And at what point did you stop feeling that conviction from other attorneys or the judges behind the bench where it was like, oh, this is not as welcoming as we first felt? Is there a point you remember specifically about that?
Well, that was certainly when we ended up at the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. So we won in federal district court, and the judge issued a temporary restraining order which said, Ohio, when John dies, you have to fill out his death certificate correctly. You have to recognize their marriage. And it was a temporary order, so the state could not appeal. John died 3 months later, and his death certificate was accurate. 2 months after that, the judge made that order permanent, and at that point, the state appealed. Now, at that point, the Sixth Circuit consolidated our case along with the birth certificate case our attorney Al was leading, as well as 4 cases from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan. So there were 6 cases total, and we went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which right from the start, Al, our attorney, said, I'm forewarning you, this is considered the most conservative appeals court in the country. So we went into that feeling a little uncertain, and they ruled against us. And it was a 2-to-1, it was a three-judge panel, and it was a 2-to-1 ruling against us. So that was the moment when I thought, okay, this isn't going as well as I'd hoped. But it was also the moment when I could have, decided I need to take a step back. I want to go back to my life. John's been gone for about a year now, and I just want to go back to being quiet Jim, not being in the midst of everything. But I realized I couldn't do it. I still hadn't lived up to my promises to John. So that was the low point for me, but it was also the point when suddenly there was the silver lining. First appeals court to rule against marriage equality, we now had a split. So the hope was maybe now the Supreme Court will take it.
One of the most compelling characters, I think, in the book is Judge Daughtry, who was a female judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal, Martha Daughtry, who was the one judge who supported marriage equality. Of the 3-judge panel, she was on the side of marriage equality, and there's a great scene of in the book of Judge Daughtry describing how she tried to convince these two more conservative judges right after oral arguments in the Sixth Circuit to rule on the side of marriage equality. She said something like to Judge Jeff Sutton, but Jeff, these two men were in love. And unfortunately, she lost the vote, and her opinion was, of course, read around the world. It was a scathing opinion. But in the book, she compares this fight for marriage equality to the fight to gain the right, to vote, women's rights, and in fact has a first edition copy of Susan B. Anthony's book on the history of women's suffrage in her office. So we were very lucky to get her to a sitting federal judge to come talk on the record about how she felt about this case.
That's great. So Jim, throughout the writing and working with Debbie, can you talk to the process of that, and were there intimate moments of your life, things that you felt were private or things that were coming out that were needing to be shared in the writing of the book?
Oh, absolutely. I can say without hesitation that writing this book, but also having the opportunity to be involved in this case and to fight for this and to speak about it, all of it combined, it gave me the opportunity to keep talking about John and to keep him foremost in my mind. It kept him alive. And it helped my grieving process in a great way. And Debbie has this incredible way of pulling details out of my head. My memory's always been one of the forest, not of the trees. So she would ask me questions and ask for memories, and it was always the broader strokes. Wasn't the details, and she would keep pushing me. So Jim, what color shirt? What was the weather like? What was happening in Cincinnati? What were you eating?
Yeah.
And she just had this incredible way of pushing me and making me actually dig deeper and pull out those details, which I would have forgotten and didn't realize were there. So working on the book was a really good experience because it was healing, it was therapeutic, and I got to relive a lot of really good things. I shed a lot of tears, but they were healing tears, and it was really great. So it was this constant back and forth of conversations, memories, writing, how's this, change this, how's that, change that, love that, keep that, add this. And it was just a really good experience. And for me, the fact that I did know Debbie, and it was this phenomenally successful journalist asking me if I wanted to help write a book about my life with John, it was this sense of comfort that I felt with her, comfort and safety, because she wasn't a stranger. So it was a really good experience.
I had to take Jim back about 40-some years, but I had to take out Gerhard Steen, his civil rights lawyer, who was a main character in the book, back about 60-some years. So he, described to me his life growing up on a chicken farm outside of Cleveland in this, rural community, and his father, tended to thousands of chickens in this Amish community, and he got a full ride to law school at NYU and could have gone on anywhere. His friends went on to big name law firms, but he wanted to go back to Cincinnati to be a civil rights lawyer, and he made no money, and he bought a house, with this small inheritance, and he's still living in that same house. So, Al's career as a civil rights lawyer, I've met a lot of lawyers as a journalist, and he is truly an inspiring man. I mean, he's scrappy, and he's always rumpled, and his tie's all messed up, and his hair's blowing every which way, and his office has green carpet from the 1970s, and he's just a true believer, and I was really moved by him, so much so that I've told my younger son I want him to be a civil rights lawyer when he grows up.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough good things about Al. I really think if any other attorney had knocked on our door 5 days after our wedding, I'm not sure we would have done this. But Al is just, as Debbie said, he is this true believer about civil rights and fighting for people. And throughout the entire 2 years, he never lost sight of the fact that there were real people at the heart of this, real people with a real story, real people who were being harmed. And he fought. I mean, you'll learn in the book, he got pushback from national organizations saying, this is not the right lawsuit. This is not the right time for this. We don't think you should be doing this. And Al's reply was always, I have clients who are being harmed. This is absolutely the right thing to do. And he is just this incredibly intelligent, dedicated, kind man.
He had spent 35 years fighting for the rights of women and children and the gay community because his younger brother is gay, and had taken on a case against a Catholic high school back in the 80s and lost. And then he took on the city of Cincinnati in the early 1990s because the city had passed, had embedded in its charter a law that said you couldn't protect the gay community with any kind of anti-discrimination laws. And he spent 5 years personally trying to take that law down without pay. I mean, almost lost his shirt, almost left the practice of law, took the case all the way to the US Supreme Court and lost. And so this case was in some ways redemption, I think, for Al, and it brought him back to the Supreme Court a second time. And as you know, arguing in front of the Supreme Court is a make or break, moment for lawyers and their legal careers. And Al stepped down and decided not to be the oralist in this case because there was a more experienced oralist and a brilliant oralist here in DC who he felt would do a better job. That's how committed Al was. He actually stepped down and didn't argue the case because he wanted to do right by his clients.
And Debbie, what was your involvement with the LGBT community before writing, during writing, and now a year after the case? Book just came out.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, a week ago?
2 weeks, yeah.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I was not involved. I was really an outsider looking into the politics of gay rights. I mean, obviously I knew and supported marriage equality, but I had never really looked into it. I mean, I don't write about those kinds of issues, but when I heard about this case, like I think so many other people, I was so moved by the practical problems that couples faced. The fact that John could not get an accurate death certificate and Jim was not listed as a surviving spouse seemed outrageous to me as an outsider looking in. It seemed punitive. And beyond that, there were parents in this case who couldn't get accurate birth certificates for their children. So here they have gone to the trouble of adopting or having children, through in vitro and other ways. All they want is to protect their families. All they want is to protect their children. And the fact that they couldn't get a birth certificate as a parent, I just couldn't believe that. And I think that that was why this case in some ways spoke to so many people, because the lawyers and the plaintiffs were able to show that there were practical, technical problems that same-sex couples faced. The rest of us may not have even known about it.
Well, from my perspective, Debbie says, I was an outsider looking in, and I've noticed a change in her in our book events, and she talks about how, this case, writing this book opened her eyes to those very practical daily ways in which we were being harmed. And I think one of my favorite things I've heard you say, Debbie, is that someone asked you, what's next for you in your professional career? And I love that you said, I've spent my career mostly writing about bad people. And now that I've written about this, I think I want to keep writing about more good things. I'm not so concerned about writing about bad people now. And I thought, what a lovely thing, lovely effect for this process to have had on you to realize you get more out of that than you had been getting perhaps out of writing about bad people. So
yeah, and I think too, exactly, but I think this is a book that's about underdogs, really. It's like a David and Goliath story. It's about ordinary people who stepped out of their private lives to protect their families and the people they care most about. And then they ultimately started advocating, for the larger gay community. And, I love those kinds of stories, I mean, it's geeky, but as I was writing the book, I hear the Rocky theme in my head, and he's climbing up the steps, because these stories really are inspiring. If you read the book, you'll see these parents and what they did. Do you know after the state of Ohio was forced by a federal judge to give these parents accurate birth certificates, the state was appealing to the Sixth Circuit, so they gave them birth certificates with an asterisk on the bottom that said, pending the outcome of the Sixth Circuit or something like that. Even then, they couldn't get, all they want's a birth certificate, and who does that really affect? It's just, they're kids, they're just trying to protect them. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a story about underdogs, and I've always been moved by stories like that.
Yeah, because now your audience, you've had quite an exposure to LGBT community, and so maybe even broader for both of you, our alphabet soup of LGBTQ, QIAA. How do you feel about that community as a whole? What are we doing to address issues across the board? What role, Jim, as an activist, now the face of an entire movement, how do you feel we're addressing the community as a whole? Are we doing enough?
I think we can always do more. You know, for me personally, over the past 2 years, it's been an important thing for me to make sure I talk about our transgender siblings. And I know there's more to our community that I should be talking about or I could be talking about. But for me, over the past couple of years, you know, marriage equality, I knew there'd be backlash, but the backlash has been so vicious against our transgender siblings that it's been a point for me to make to always talk about our transgender community. And I also talk about how, you know, stories change lives. And I think this book, it's nothing but a story of love. It's John's and my love. It's the love of the other plaintiffs for their spouses, their partners, their children. And stories do change hearts and minds. And I think about my own experience within the LGBTQ community. You know, up until a little over a year ago, I had no friends who were part of the transgender community, at least none that I specifically knew. And over the past 14, 15 months, I've lucky enough now to say I have quite a few transgender friends. And I realize the change that has made in me, in my understanding, my attitudes, my outlook. And for me, that's what this community is all about. It's sharing our stories, and it's making sure we share the stories of everyone who's part of the community, because that's how we change people's perspectives. I mean, that happened to me personally. I had a friend of mine from 1989. I've known her that long. She said, you know, Jim, watching you, having met John, having seen your relationship, and watching you fight for John, fight for your marriage and everything you've done, she said, you have changed my opinion on marriage equality. So stories are what change the countries, change the world. And for our community, that's what we have to keep doing. We have to tell each other stories. And for me, that's been telling stories about my transgender friends and how important that is and how that affects change in our country. So there's a lot of work to do, absolutely. And unfortunately, sometimes parts of our community fall through the cracks, and we have to make sure that we don't let that happen.
Debbie, anything?
I think he answered it, yeah.
So in the same vein, yesterday marked the 47th anniversary since the Stonewall riots began. We have 1 year since the Obergefell v. Hodges case, and I'm trying to see what's for the next. What do we tell the next generation of LGBT community? I know a lot of we call it the Pride Parade, when historically it was the Pride March, because this was a march outside to riot out of a city-sanctioned harassment from police at Stonewall, with that just becoming a national monument. And what's next for the LGBT community?
I think what you're seeing is within the community is more of a concentration, more of an effort to preserve our history. And the fact that Stonewall was just named a national monument, that is a huge part of that. But it's on all of our shoulders to make sure the younger generation, the people who come after us, know what we went through and understand that things weren't always as good as they are today. There have been so many people who've come before us. I mean, I know personally I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for my heroes, Edie Windsor, Harvey Milk, Frank Kameny, so many others. And if it weren't for the people who really put their lives on the line and risked everything to fight for equality and dignity, I certainly wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have had the luxury of finding myself in that position. And that's what we have to make sure our future generations don't forget, is that it might be great right now for you, but remember who came before, what happened before. And also we have to make sure that people understand we can go backwards. I mean, unfortunately, in so many ways in our nation's history, when we have those steps forward, fortunately, we oftentimes have steps backward. And we have to make sure that people understand that and fight to keep the progress we've made and to keep moving forward instead of allowing us to move backwards. So for me, it's all about education. I mean, I think in so many ways, that's what it comes down to. We have to educate others who don't know the LGBTQ community. We have to educate those of us in our community.
We have such an acknowledgement and recognition for the LGBT community, what they have been through and faced throughout so much, AIDS epidemic, Stonewall, so much of the current generation, myself included, that wasn't a part of our, wasn't a part of my everyday life. And it wasn't until, as Roberta had spoke on, the unfortunate events of Orlando, that it was then again brought back to the forefront of, we're not done. We haven't achieved everything. And so that was, I wanted to hear your activist perspective on that. And how about from a journalist standpoint? What have you seen in the media shifts, changes?
Well, I think, 1 year ago, support for marriage equality, it was overwhelming. All the polls in the CNN and in the Washington Post showed the majority of Americans believed in marriage equality and support and love the LGBT community. And then Orlando, and it definitely seems like one step forward, one step back. And I think civil rights movements in general, that's kind of often the way it plays out, whether it's, civil rights or women's rights, that kind of thing. And I think Orlando was, unfortunately shows that there are people in the public and perhaps even people in public office who still don't support the gay community. It was a hate crime.
And I know for me, Orlando, one of the things that I wasn't expecting personally, it was a reminder. And it was also a moment when I felt something I'd never felt before in my out gay life. I've been out since I was 26, and I can honestly say in that time, never once have I felt unsafe, threatened, and I've never felt the direct recipient of discrimination. Maybe I've been ignorant, maybe I've been clueless. I can be fairly clueless at times, so, but that day, I suddenly felt afraid. And for me, that was, I think, a much needed reminder that I'm fortunate in my life and I haven't felt afraid before. And that was a reminder that, you know what, Jim, there are kids out there every day who are that afraid. Our transgender family, every day, they're living their lives that afraid. And for me, it was a necessary reminder that no matter how good my life might be, it can change in an instant, and there's still a lot of hatred out there. And that's one of those things I think Orlando has served as a wake-up call and a reminder to many of us in the community that no matter how good things might seem, we still have a long way to go.
I think that's an awesome charge for all of us. And just want to take some questions from the audience. If anybody had been thinking about something that you would like to ask one or both of them, I'll probably just give you this mic, so if you don't mind to come up, that way we can make sure this is being recorded, so make sure that we get it captured. There was one in the back. Come up, please. If possible. Sorry, I know there's technology in the way. Sure, you can take that one. That works.
Hi, thanks for being here. I was curious about sort of the resistance that you got from some of the, I guess, big groups that said, "Oh no, your case is not the right case," and all that, and how you sort of just persisted through that. Kind of what resistance you got, what your reaction to that. So.
Well, I can say that resistance was all directed towards Al, our attorney, and other attorneys on the case. Al did a phenomenal job, and the other attorneys did as well, of keeping us the focus of it, but also keeping us out of a lot of the things that we didn't need to worry about. So that pushback was directed towards Al. So once our case came out, shortly thereafter, the ACLU joined our case. And then when he did the birth certificate case, Lambda Legal joined that case. And there was quite a bit of pushback saying, you know, this doesn't fit within our strategy that we had for marriage equality, and this isn't the right thing to do. And we only knew about it after the fact. And Al simply said, no, I have to do this. I have clients who are being harmed. This is the absolute right thing to do. And he just kept pushing and kept talking about us. And he brought them all over to his side. And from that point on, I personally never ever felt any pushback from any of those national organizations. They were a very cohesive team of attorneys and experts working on our behalf. So I thank Al for that. He really kept us out of that. He made it all about us.
It was Al. He was the head, but all of the attorneys in all of 4 states faced this pushback, to the point where they actually asked some of the national groups for funding to support expert witnesses or other things that lawyers have to pay for. Remember, they were working with no pay, and they couldn't get it in the beginning because the national groups, perhaps rightly so, were worried about the Sixth Circuit, you know, saying no. In fact, one of the attorneys in Michigan actually sold her house to fund this case. She was that determined to keep going. I mean, these are lawyers. Al had been in business 30-some years. He could afford it, but the other lawyers, I mean, they did all kinds of things to come up with the money, because they basically worked for free for the better part of 2.5 years.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Oh, there's one.
Please. Mr. Bob. I will say this is our first chair of LC Globe. This is our first chair, so set up our organization, Globe, 20 years ago. You're welcome. 25 years ago. Here you go.
Quite 25. I was just wondering about the oral arguments at the Supreme Court. Now, we know that we can't always predict from oral arguments how the justices are going to rule, because there are all these briefs that get filed, and there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. But I'm wondering what your impressions were during the oral arguments, if there was ever a time when you felt, wow, this is going really well, or, oh my God, this is not looking good.
You know, during oral arguments, I really tried hard not to let myself wander too much down pathways or thought or avenues of thought, because I know I'm not smart enough. I'm not an attorney. I don't know the justices well enough to have put any thought into, well, that justice asked this question, so that means X, versus they asked that question, that means Y. I wouldn't let myself do that. So I spent my time in oral arguments just writing notes about what was asked, what was said, and I really tried hard not to think too hard. Now, I did leave that day thinking, I think we're going to win. How much of that was what I actually got out of the oral arguments versus how much of that was just me knowing I was on the right side and being an optimist, I'm not sure. But I did leave feeling pretty optimistic. And as far as the oral arguments, the things I remember was when, you know, the whole argument around, well, why are we changing the meaning of something that's meant the same thing for millennia, marriage? It's meant the same thing for all of these years. Why are we changing it? And it was RBG, wasn't it? RBG said, well, no, I disagree. We have actually changed the meaning of marriage because women are no longer considered property of their husbands. That was one of my favorite moments. And another one was, and this was during the arguments for the right to marry, and I forget who it was, but it was, again, back to, you know, why are we changing this? And if we think back to the ancient Greek civilization, you know, we know that same-sex relations were okay because we can read about that, and we know that was part of their culture. It was accepted. but they didn't have same-sex marriage, at least not from anything that we've been able to tell. Well, why do you think that is? And Mary Bonato just point blank, well, Your Honor, I'm in no position to even consider what ancient Greek philosophers believed or thought. It was just this really ridiculous point of, well, ancient Greek, they didn't, so why should we? And well, and Mary's response was, well, how am I supposed to know what they thought or what their feelings were? I just thought it was a great response.
But the beautiful thing about that is what the justices didn't know is that she had studied the classics in college. So she was actually prepared to answer those questions. She wasn't expecting them, but she was prepared to answer them, because I remember Al Gerhardstein, there's a scene in the book where he said he was kind of holding his breath because he was not expecting the ancient Greece questions. Are we really going back that far? And Mary Bonato is this brilliant lawyer, but had never argued before the Supreme Court. But she was prepared, she studied the classics, and she handled it. But I think to answer your question too, and Jim can talk about this, everybody was listening to Justice Kennedy because of course we all thought he was a swing vote, so every question was analyzed and which way is he going to go, and the room kind of quieted down when he spoke up.
Yep. And my absolute favorite moment of the entire 2.5 hours was in the last few minutes. And the second part of the 2.5 hours were the arguments for the right to recognition. And Douglas Hallward-Driemeier, who was arguing, he was doing his closing. And during his closing, as I've mentioned, every single attorney on that team kept the plaintiffs front and center. They always brought it back to us. They always brought it back to the fact that these are real people. These are people being harmed. And in the last few lines of his closing statements, he brought it back and talked about John and me and about our relationship. And for me, I loved it. I mean, it felt like John and I had the last word, which was pretty powerful. But I love that, again, he brought it back to us, and he brought it back to a real couple who suffered real harm. And I really respect that they did that every chance they had. They brought it back to us.
And this attorney is a veteran Supreme Court oralist. He lives here in D.C., and I think he's argued before every circuit court in the country and multiple times before the Supreme Court. And he knows not to get emotional. I mean, he knows this is not what the justices want to see. But he was determined to slip that in.
Yep. And
I was told by multiple sources in the courtroom that when he turned around and went back to sit down, he had tears in his eyes. So I kind of thought that was, really a really sweet moment.
Yep.
Did you still want to ask, please?
Hi, so my question actually has two parts, if that's all right.
Of course.
So how did you handle, on a personal and legal level, the backlash that you must have received from religious organizations in the country during your case? And something that I've noticed is that a lot of the hate crimes that are directed towards LGBT members of our community tend to arise because of their interpretation of a particular religious text. Mm-hmm. And so do you believe, as an activist, that it's possible to prevent hate crimes against LGBT members of our community without reforming these religious institutions?
Ooh, good questions.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so in the first one, when I get this question, I think it always amazes people when I say in the almost 2 years from the start of our case to the Supreme Court ruling, I got 4 pieces of mail that were less than supportive. That's it, 4. As opposed to thousands, honestly, it feels like millions of cards, letters, emails, messages, and people stopping me everywhere I go to thank me, to share stories, to tell me why this fight, why marriage equality meant something to them or someone they loved. So for me, personally, I've experienced nothing but love and support, and it's been an amazing 2 years because of that. Every single time that happens, when someone stops me and shows me a photo, talks about someone they love, it's this incredible gift and this incredible thank you that the other plaintiffs and I stood up to fight. So personally, I've experienced almost no backlash, and I love that I can say that. To me, it gives me hope for our country. The religion part, marriage, there's such this this feeling of ownership to the word marriage by religions. And I always did my best just to reply with, well, you know what? We go to a government office for a marriage license. It is a civil institution. No religion is required. I mean, any person in this country can get married without having a religion involved. So I would always come back to that. And I've never quite understood this feeling that they own that word, that no one else can use it. And do I think we will continue to see continued hatred directed our way or pushback around LGBTQ rights from a religious perspective? Absolutely. And I think it will be a process of religious leaders and religious people having that realization that, you know, love thy neighbor, the golden rule, judge not. Those concepts seem to be forgotten. And I think until religions really embrace that and live that and step away from focusing on one or two lines when they don't focus on every other line, until those types of changes occur, I'm afraid we will continue to see this. And that saddens me because, you know, I was always taught that religion is about loving your neighbor and treating them the way you want to be treated. So I'm hopeful one day maybe that will be the case, but it will take a lot of effort and time and reformation within various churches, various religious organizations.
Great, thank you. We'll end with the word hopeful. Yes. And before we do end, I want to invite our current chair of LC Globe, Nicholas Brown, up for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First off, I just would like to thank Jim and Debbie on behalf of all of the LGBTQ employees here at the library for taking the time out of your busy lives to share your experiences with us, because to all of us, you are people who we look up to as leaders. Debbie, you for helping sort of tell the story of what happened. That's a remarkable feat that we as library people really, really appreciate that. So thank you for your contribution to this. And to Jim, you're one of those people who we will, for the rest of our lives, remember having been able to see in person and to witness and to share moments with you, and especially in this Pride Month this year, which has been so difficult in so many ways. You give us inspiration, and your tireless commitment to fighting for all of us is something that we can only strive to come this close to matching in our lives. So thank you both for your contributions. As that's kind of alluded to, this is a huge day for us at the Library of Congress, I think, in terms of working with so many colleagues around the library, especially Chief of Staff Robert Newland, Law Librarian of Congress Roberta Schaefer, and various colleagues in EEODP, Roberto and Eric and Travis, of course, to come together to celebrate our LGBTQ community. We have had a long time at the library of working towards gaining more recognition, and that is certainly happening with the support of leaders such as Robert and Roberta. So we really appreciate everything that they're doing for us. And we also appreciate the folks who have taken leadership roles in LC Globe over the past 20 some odd years. If you've ever been on the LC Globe Steering Committee, could you stand up for me, please, so we can recognize you? These are the folks who work behind the scenes to make everything possible. Another special thank you goes out to Leah from the Law Library, who has worked very closely with us on this event. And before I go into some housekeeping announcements, I just want to share my impression of what the library's role is in capturing LGBTQ history. All of us that work here at the library are charged with collecting, preserving, and serving cultural history and cultural memory, regardless of what demographic or regardless of what topic, what religion, what subject area. We're here to do it all, which is a really remarkable charge, and it's a difficult charge. But I think with the LGBTQ collections in particular, we are doing an astonishing job, and we're all working to spread the word. And part of that is on you all, to share with your colleagues and friends around the world how important the library's LGBTQ collections are. We have an LGBTQ portal for Pride Month, which gives you some of the highlights, which is at loc.gov/LGBT. You can go on there to see highlights about the Walt Whitman papers, for example, or Leonard Bernstein's collection, or vast range of American poets who have read their work here at the library. Our collections are vast. As you know, we have over 160 million items. A large portion of that has to do with LGBT culture, and not necessarily in a direct title. You know, it's not LGBT issues in the 1970s. However, our lives touch all parts of society because we contribute to all parts of society. So you can go into collections having to do with any topic, and you can see the legacy of our community having a major impact on what we know today as society. So thank you all for contributing to that work. And for those of you who are visiting us today, please visit our resources and check them out. The library is open to anyone. You just need to present a photo ID and get a reader card, and you should be ages 16 and up. And if you'd like to connect with us on a more research level in terms of cultivating the LGBTQ collections, consider joining our LGBT studies group, which meets monthly. And we work to kind of dig out some of the hidden treasures relating to our area of study and then promoting them to the public. So I'll leave you with that, and just some general announcements. We will have book sales in the back. Copies of Jim and Debbie's book are going for $25 at a discount, so get them while they're hot. And Jim and Debbie have been kind enough to agree to sign copies for all of you. And also a huge thanks to the Law Library for arranging for a light reception for us. So we invite you all to join us in the back of the room before you depart today. And one last thing is that our final Pride Month event is taking place on July 6th, slightly outside of Pride Month, but we're very filled with pride, so we can keep going all year. And that is a really fascinating event featuring authors from the Golden Crown Literary Society, which, if you don't know what that organization is, it's an organization that promotes lesbian fiction writing. So we're going to have some really distinguished authors come here to the library on July 6th. Hope you join us for that. It's at 11 a.m. in LM 139 downstairs. And if you're interested in joining us in more social capacities, check out our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/LCGlobe. There are things like parade pictures, invites to happy hours, and that kind of thing. So again, thank you to Debbie and Jim, and also Travis for moderating today, and to Robert and Roberta and Leah, and thank you for being here.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.